Okay, well, welcome. I am Fran Dyke, President of the League of Women Voters of Portland. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization that works to promote political responsibility through informed and active participation in government. Membership information is available on our website or at the table at the back of the room. We thank the Multnomah Bar Foundation and the Sarah Fruing Fund for their generous support of this program. Tonight's event is being recorded by Metro East Community Media. The event will be available for on-demand viewing from a link on our website, lwvpdx.org, and from the website of Metro East Community Media, metroeast.org. To view the event on local access cable TV, see the playback schedule posted on our website and in your program. Our moderator tonight is Barbara Dudley, Senior Fellow at the Center for Public Service at Portland State University and a member of the League of Women Voters of Portland. In addition to a distinguished career in executive and legal positions with organizations such as the California Agricultural Labor Relations Board, the National Lawyers Guild, Greenpeace USA, and the National AFL-CIO, Barbara is a founding member and senior policy advisor of the Working Families Party of Oregon and was active in their successful effort to bring fusion voting to Oregon. I will now turn the program over to Barbara.
Okay, welcome to part 2 of this discussion of election methods and systems of representation. Today's discussion helps to inform the position of the League of Women Voters of Oregon, and that position will guide the advocacy of the League, and it will be adopted by consensus after a formal study. In this second part of the discussion, we will hear from 3 people who have studied election methods and systems of representation and worked for election method reforms. The first is Professor Todd Donovan, who just flew down from Western Washington University in Bellingham after his classes today to be with us. He teaches political science and conducts research on elections and opinion in Washington State, in the US, and occasionally in Australia, Canada, and Great Britain. He's the author of 4 books and dozens of scholarly articles on these subjects. So, welcome. We're glad you made it. And proceed, please, Professor Donovan.
Is it going? Yes. This is on. Now it's on. Okay, thanks. And I'll kind of be struggling to see this stuff. Yeah, that's sort of a working title. I want to mainly talk about ranked choice voting. I don't know how much we're going to be covering this stuff, but people probably know this was on the ballot in Maine and it passed, and in Benton County in Oregon and it passed. So it's, not a big sweeping thing on election reform, but just some stuff that I know from doing some surveys, studying communities that have adopted that form of election reform. These are criteria that I stole from the League of Women Voters of California. But, what do we look for in terms of, what people expect in terms of good functioning elections, and majority rule. Does the person with the most votes win? Minority representation, avoiding the kind of strategic voting where people are afraid to cast a ballot for their most preferred candidate, offering a meaningful range of choices. Some reforms might increase participation, preventing fraud. I mean, these are just, we can start with any kind of criteria, but these are some maybe good working ones. Can any reform accomplish all these things? And some of those things are probably going to be like mutually exclusive, or one reform that might do one might make some of the other things more difficult. But anyway, so just kind of starting with how people in America think about their elections, and then I'll give you sort of my pet reform. It's not my pet reform, but the one that I've been studying most recently. But in terms of those criteria, just we have an odd reality here, I guess, in this country that despite the fact that our elections, they really, for the most part, work pretty good compared to the rest of the world. I mean, there's a lot of these things we can improve, but in terms of, fair elections that have, rigid laws that are well regulated, where, we really pretty confident that the vote counts are accurate, peaceful transitions of power. I mean, we have that stuff. But if you actually look at American public opinion about elections, and I'm not saying ranked choice voting is going to fix this stuff. And this is before Donald Trump started telling everybody that elections are rigged. About 1 in 5 Americans, when asked in 2000, is an international survey of like 37 countries. Do you think elections in your country are very honest, very dishonest? And Americans, we're up there with Venezuela as the most likely to say that our elections were dishonest. Only 39% of Americans were saying that they think elections are very honest or somewhat honest. I should have a better presentation of that. But in most countries, it's like 80%, 90% people think their elections are honest. We were only just barely ahead of Russia as like 36 to 37 countries in terms of being most cynical about elections. And if you think about so what's that picking up in 2004? It's probably the residue of the Florida, the presidential election. So people were asked that question, and they're probably thinking about what happened in 2000. So if we ask people questions about how they think elections are performing now after the last presidential election, I think we'd see just that kind of cynicism. But again, this stuff's before all of the rhetoric from the current campaign. 1 in 3 Republicans believe that voter impersonation, voter fraud is a real problem, that it happens frequently. Only about half of Americans, this is in 2014, are very confident that their votes are being counted accurately. Most Americans think campaign funds, legal campaign contributions, are corrupt and dishonest. People want a third party a majority of Americans in one survey that we did, people want to see a third party challenge Democrats and Republicans. So all that, that's when we think about what do we want to reform, part of it is how do you fix that kind of cynicism? Hopefully everybody else has ideas, because I don't have a great answer to that stuff. But I just want to kind of put into context, when we talk a lot about election reform, but that's one of the goals is, why is it that 95% of people in Norway, 96% of people in Denmark think their elections are honest and they work well, and so few people think that here? And it's part of it's the campaign finance thing. Part of it is having people get elected who didn't necessarily win the popular vote. That's kind of the putting this in the big picture thing. And now in 2016, we just had a campaign where most of the 2 nominees were not very popular. The popular vote winner lost the Electoral College. People are really cynical about negative campaigns. So can we fix any of this? We can do a little better, I think. So that's where the ranked choice. I'm not saying ranked choice voting is going to fix it. I'll come back to those criteria, that I had at the beginning that I got from the California League. But just to say a couple things about ranked choice voting. One reason I got interested in looking at this is there's arguments from the use of this in Fiji, and I'll explain what the system is a little bit, and even Australia, that there's something about this kind of election system that maybe facilitates more civility in campaigns. So that's something some colleagues of mine, we were able to study by surveying candidates who ran in ranked choice voting systems, surveying voters. But that was kind of one of the idea, and I'll explain that idea some more, that there's maybe some reforms that could affect campaign tone. And we've got this rare opportunity in the United States. I have the list in one of my slides, at least half a dozen more places that have adopted ranked choice voting, so we can compare people in elections in cities using winner-take-all plurality rules.
Kristen did give us the list.
Okay.
So we have a little bit of that, and Representative Rayfield is here from Benton County as well.
Oh, good.
So we have a lot of,
Because I can't remember all the cities. Minneapolis was one of the more recent, bigger places to adopt it. So this unfortunately has too many names: alternative vote. It used to be instant runoff voting. The group that really advocates fair vote, the Center for Voting and Democracy, has kind of tried to really rebrand this as ranked choice voting. They get mad when we call it rank choice voting because that doesn't come out. But it's in a sense a majoritarian system. It's just, it produces a single winner, but it allows voters to cast their preferences. So I don't know how much we talked about this before, but you rank 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. candidate with the least support is eliminated in the first count, and then you look at those ballots and see, okay, who'd they rank second, and you keep doing that until somebody has a majority of the votes. But it's that ranking thing that potentially makes it interesting, because at least as far as like the civility or the tone of a campaign, because if you're running for office in a winner-take-all system, you don't have too many disincentives for trashing your opponent. If you're running in one of these preferential ranked choice systems, you might not want to really alienate the supporters of your opponent, because you could potentially be getting their second preference or their third preference or something. So it could potentially either lower the incentive for candidates to attack, it makes campaigns less zero-sum. That's sort of the working hypothesis here. I just said all that, but I assume people got to understand how ranked choice voting works. Australians can figure it out. Anybody can do it. Rank 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But it produces a majority winner. It lets people who maybe support candidates who are not going to win still be able to express that preference. But it changes how we think. Maybe it changes how candidates are in a campaign. One of the big reasons this has been adopted some places is it's potentially cheaper. You get rid of a primary, that's less elections to administer. Some advocates of this like the idea that it potentially gets rid of the spoiler effect, that if you vote for Gary Johnson or Jill Stein, those preferences eventually their second preferences will eventually transfer to elect a majority winner. Third parties do not get elected under this system in Australia. The House of Representatives is elected this way, and it's usually, invariably, it's just the two major parties. But the third parties are active because they can show to the major parties, this many preferences from the Greens transferred to the Labour Party, so that gives them some leverage and it gives them some ability to survive. But it's that accommodation and that bargaining for preferences, and the multiple candidates kind of running for not just people's first preferences, but second and third preferences, that we think might lead to less attacks. So the study, I did this with my colleague Carolyn Tolbert, who's at the University of Iowa, and Dave Redlosk, who was at Rutgers, and now I think he's moved to Delaware. But okay, we saw the list earlier. But it's kind of a natural experiment where we're trying to isolate people who are exposed to mayoral and city council campaigns under this preferential voting system, and then identical people in identical cities that are exposed to winner-take-all elections. And we can't really do that but it's a natural experiment. It's not a real controlled experiment. I covered that sort of stuff. It's sort of, if we ever get into a discussion of cumulative voting, it's another election system where, if there's 5 people running for office, each individual gets 5 votes, and you can give 5 of them to one candidate, or 2 of them to one candidate, and 3 to another candidate. It's a similar kind of thing where it lets candidates campaign not just for a single vote, but for people's second preferences or third preferences. This is how we tried to do it in terms of how do you find similar people in similar cities that are not exposed to preferential voting but are exposed to winner-take-all voting. We did candidate and campaign surveys in Minneapolis, and then we tried to find cities that were demographically similar to Minneapolis that were also having the same kind of elections at the same time. So we have an amalgam of candidates and survey respondents, voters, in places like Seattle and Boston, and they're supposed to be like the mirrors of the people in Minneapolis. And we can say, okay, Minneapolis is using ranked choice voting, Seattle's using winner-take-all. Let's ask candidates what they think about the campaigns. Let's ask the voters what they think about campaigns. And so, we did this in a number of cities, and the match places, a lot of statistics went into kind of determining how we picked those. But there's never a perfect match for Minneapolis. But we tried. So that, truth in advertising there. Repeated it again in another year when there were a lot of elections in the California cities. So then matched those with other California cities that are using winner-take-all elections. And okay, so some quick results. The candidate survey, the one thing we really expected to see in the candidate survey was asking people, did you campaign asking for like second and third preferences? We didn't really see that. We saw some interesting stuff about campaign tone that I'll get here in a second. The asterisk means that this is a significant difference between the places that used ranked choice voting and the places that used plurality. So they're really, on a lot of our measures, we didn't find anything really jumping out as being different. The last one, we thought candidates in the ranked choice voting cities would be more likely to say that they're building alliances with other candidates because they're going to be asking for second preferences and third preferences. They were a little more likely to say that that was important on a scale of 1 to 5 in the ranked choice voting cities, but it wasn't statistically significant. There is a difference. The candidates running in RCV said they were less likely to, that money was less important. That was a significant difference. But the main thing would have been the last one there. We really didn't see that happening. I wasn't even paying. I'm just assuming you're keeping up with me. That's fine. So we asked candidates, aside from how did you campaign, we didn't really see huge differences in them saying that they campaigned differently. There were some subtle effects. But how did they perceive the campaigns? Did they see their opponents attacking them? Did they think it was more negative than campaigns in that city in previous years? And this is a significant difference. It's not huge, but like about 10% more likely for a candidate to say that they were described negatively by their rival in a winner-take-all city. So candidates running in Minneapolis and these places, slightly but significantly less likely to say that they were described in negative terms, which is kind of consistent with our idea. We asked, were candidates praising or endorsing other candidates during the campaign? I hope we phrased it better than that. I can't remember. I'm sure it was phrased better than that. But again, the candidates running under ranked choice voting were much more likely to say that they saw candidates saying positive things about other candidates, and we saw that less in the winner-take-all plurality places. Was the campaign less negative compared to others in previous years? I think is how we phrase this one. Again, they're not huge differences, but more than 10% difference, it's statistically significant. The candidates running in RCV said this was less negative than previous elections. Okay, but did the voters notice? So we did opinion surveys conducted through University of Rutgers survey lab. A couple thousand respondents in 2012 and then again in 2013 in the California city. So we replicated it. Cell phone landlines was immediately after the elections in these cities. And the results I'm going to show control for demographic things, age, race, education. It's just kind of zeroing in on the effect of what we think is the difference between living in a city using ranked choice voting and a city using, the winner-take-all. So this is, so we're kind of asking voters similar questions that we asked the candidates. Did you think the campaign this year was less negative than previous elections? And the people in the RCV cities that's the probability they would say it was less negative. So you've got if you're a voter in a city using ranked choice voting, other things being equal, you thought things were less negative. If you were a voter in an RCV city, you perceive that candidates criticized each other less. You were more satisfied with the campaigns. So anyway, is this a reform that fixes fixes some of those things, the criteria that I set out with? It might actually be more likely to lead to majority rule because it leads to a majority winner. It probably does reduce strategic voting. It makes the votes for candidates less likely to win, maybe more meaningful. It doesn't really do anything for a lot of these others. There's some arguments about whether it affects turnout or not. We can maybe talk about that later. But we did the study one year, we replicated it another year. We found the same results when we did it the second time. The one thing I guess I'll close with, that negativity in campaigns might actually be a good thing because it's information. We can't talk about, we don't really have data on the quality of this information, but voters and candidates seem to think things were more civil or less negative under ranked choice voting. So.
We will come back to this question because there will be time for you all to speak to each other's presentations as well. And Representative Rayfield can also speak to, obviously, ranked choice voting and how it went in Benton County. But we are now going to hear from Lamar Wise, who is, he is the legislative director of the Oregon Student Association. He has a degree in political science from the University of Oregon. He served there in student government and as the representative on the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. He is going to share his thoughts on election methods and how they affect participation of younger people and people of color in the political process. Mr. Wise.
Thank you.
Something went wrong.
Hello? Okay, this is way better. Hey everyone. It's definitely nice to be here and around folks that care about voting and care about expanding the methods. This has been an interesting week for me, and just so folks know, I was able to come back from a conference actually not too long ago. We held an Oregon Students of Color conference this past weekend in Corvallis, and we had time to debrief some of what we were feeling and what students should be doing to participate in in voting and what we could do moving forward. But just a little bit about the Oregon Student Association. So the Oregon Student Association represents about 100,000 students statewide. We have members from universities and community colleges, and together we pull our resources together to make sure that we are represented in the legislature, but also on the ground, right? So we have boards of trustees, and we also have boards of education and at our community colleges, and those boards of education are elected. And so there's definitely some interest here where students want to be able to influence who represents them and who sets their tuition and who makes policy decisions for their institutions. With that being said, we also have found that there is a lot of disenfranchisement when it comes to voting. So we run a vote program. This year we were able to register almost 50,000 students to vote statewide, which is the most any organization or entity has done in this election in Oregon. Probably the nation, but haven't done my research yet, so I can't really say that just yet. You know, we do very robust education as well. We had a student voter guide that was put out where candidates were able to express their views and answer some questions pertaining to students. With that being said, though, we continue to come across some issues. We run a Unite the Vote program, which aims to focus on getting out the vote for folks of color and also folks from the LGBTQ community. And we have specific messaging for those folks and specific educational materials for those folks so that they understand what's at stake. But to be honest, even with those materials and with our efforts, we still come across people who feel like they are not a part of the process, and even if they did vote, that their vote wouldn't matter. And so that's something that we've experienced through the last few election cycles, and you know, we've definitely tried to vamp up our program and continue to address that in different ways. But at the end of the day, it's a structural problem. It's a structural problem where we want to make sure that we are doing what we can to open it up to all sorts of folks to be able to feel like they're being represented. The way I see it, there's a few issues with how we are doing our voting and how we're able to access the ballot. the Voting Rights Act was gutted, and that's an issue like for the nation. Of course, we've had champions here in Oregon that have protected a lot of voting rights and made sure that our elections have been accessible. At the same time, though, it doesn't work when we're just here and when we're just siloed here. We need champions nationwide to also bring about change and make sure that voting rights are being protected everywhere. But I bring that up because we live in a place where we have very inconsistent policies about how to vote from state to state. And with that, we also vote a lot. And we also have two major parties. So with all of that, like I've been thinking about what can we do to make sure that folks do feel like their vote is being counted, but also make sure that they feel like they're a part of the system. And I definitely appreciate the research that the League of Women Voters has done, and that was a great presentation. I particularly wanted to speak about the idea of a multi-winner race and also having representation or proportional representation. That particularly is important to me because the way I see it, we have currently we have two big parties, and I like to think of parties as big like coalitions, right? So you enter into these parties or coalitions, you probably have to compromise, and you will demand what you want, but parties have to prioritize, right? Because there's only so much time in session and only so much political capital that legislators have. And so once that capital and that time runs out, if you have opted into the coalition and your party is down on the list, then you lose. Then what do you feel like? You feel like you weren't actually part of the process. And folks have been frustrated at this, and that's why we've seen people flat out just not vote. I was in the field talking with students where they were just like, I'm just not going to vote because I don't like either of the two candidates. And I was like, first off, hold up. Like there is more than just the federal election going on, but also this is like your opportunity to actually create change, and we had to explain to them like how like the presidency and how local candidates set their tuition or set policies that directly affect them, and they just stop at what they like. At what they have seen, and they stop at how how they feel like they've been disenfranchised, and then just not vote. So I think that method in particular, the method of proportional representation, is something that we should look at seriously because it would increase, it would increase participation, or what I believe it would increase participation, and those coalitions in and of itself would still exist, but while more people being involved in the process. And so that's something that's really interesting to me, and I'm happy to be here to be able to discuss it with you all. I'm also really interested in the ranked choice voting method, and especially that it's passed in Benton County. Definitely want to be watching that pretty closely. But yeah, again, thank you all for the time, and I will yield to the representative.
Please do introduce yourself.
Fair enough. I really want to see if this works. It doesn't. I had to try. So my name is Dan Rayfield. I'm a state representative from the Corvallis area, and we have Barbara Ross here, who was a state representative of the same district that I was from. My mentor in a lot of ways. I ran for the state senate in 2010 and lost, and one of the first people I talked to was Barbara Ross, and she looked me in the eye and said, well, how are you going to feel if you lose? And it was actually some of the best advice I ever got. But my background in election reform happened about 15 years ago at Western Oregon University. University where I took an economics of politics class. We studied all the various different type of election processes, and that was something that I, at the time, didn't know that there was an alternative to plurality voting. And it actually inspired me, and once I became a state representative, and actually we had numerous elections where I saw the failings of our current system, I felt that I was in a position where I could actually do something about that. And I was very fortunate to have a friend in the area that had been involved with ranked choice voting for many, many years. And so we were able to come together, and I was, both Blair Bowier and myself were the chief co-petitioners on a measure that will implement ranked choice voting in Benton County. And I'll talk about why ranked choice voting, why we chose that, versus some of the other methods that you heard about a little bit earlier. So that's kind of the background. I think the real premise, and the one thing that I learned over the years, is that there is no perfect system. And I have to say that over and over again, there is no perfect system. However, everything is better than plurality. So with that, you find out, why do you change, right? Why would we want to change this system? And we can point to real life situations. Maybe you're a conservative. You might look at the primary election this year, where you may not have been a Donald Trump fan, but maybe you were a Cruz or a Rubio fan. And if you look at some of the exit polling, you might be able to deduce that actually a majority of the voters in that primary would have preferred a different candidate to Donald Trump, but these, what I would call kind of other like-minded candidates, split the votes amongst themselves. And you've kind of heard that concept, vote splitting. If you are a Democrat, you might look at, everybody remembers the Gore-Bush Nader race. And everybody cites that, and they talk about Nader, who took exit polling would show that 60% of the Nader voters would have voted for Gore under those circumstances. Another important thing to note is that 40% of Nader voters would not have cast a ballot at all. So always remember that, and I'll kind of talk about that a little bit later. And so as the professor was talking about, that one of the things that really moves voters is this majority representation, and that our democracy is really founded on the fact that the people that we elect to office are representative of who are actually casting the votes. And so when we elect somebody who does not represent a majority of the population, that can have we can lose faith in some of the system. We can get results that we're not necessarily comfortable with, and we start to, some people may feel disenfranchised just because of that fact. We all now have the big movement of the national popular vote, which we're again going to see, I think, be revived again after this current election cycle. The other things, you have the spoilers. That's why people would like to change. People have the lesser of two evils. They don't like voting for the lesser of two evils. We found that to be a very compelling issue when we did our polling in Benton County. In this election cycle, a lot of folks felt frustrated between the two, and maybe it was the lesser of four evils this year. It depends on how you feel. And so having more parties is generally viewed as a good thing. Under our current system, the plurality system, third-party candidates are not encouraged to participate overtly sometimes. In other cases, there's just not a lot of motivation because you look at the greater good, where in a tight race, in a swing seat in Oregon or elsewhere, if you're a Republican, you're really not going to want a Libertarian to join that race. If you're a Democrat, you're really not going to want a Progressive or a Green Party to join that race, and you're keeping your fingers crossed that that won't impact the outcome of the election. And a good election system shouldn't discourage voices. And so that's something that I think people are frustrated with. We should have an election system that encourages these third-party voices. And then, of course, we have those adverse outcomes. And that is another thing that we're looking at, where we are electing people kind of like we're talking about. So that's what really was the catalyst for us in Benton County to try this. We had had a couple of county commissioner races a long time ago where some of the county commissioners, we had a strong third-party candidate, and they were elected with less than 50% of the vote. And Benton County was also a unique place where we had voting machines where it wasn't going to cost us anything in terms of technology, of actually hardware, to upgrade our system and actually try ranked choice voting. And as we noted, it was called instant runoff voting, but it was rebranded. And so the difference, and I thought I would talk about, is a pure form of ranked choice voting. A pure form of ranked choice voting is where you have one election, no more primaries. You eliminate those altogether, and everything moves to the general election. And I think a lot of people feel is you have a low turnout primary, and why should we have people in a low turnout primary choosing who are going to be our representatives in our democracy? And that's a fundamental problem. And so ranked choice voting is part of that solution, is to shift everything to a general election. Another thing that we have is we have non-affiliate voters that feel very frustrated, because if you're in a progressive county or a conservative county, you're never going to choose your government. Or at least, have the full suite of options that you would if you were able to participate in a primary. So again, ranked choice voting in its pure form would shift everybody to a general election where you'd be able to rank everybody. At that point, in theory, you could eliminate the actual primary altogether, saving money. In Oregon, we have some unique features where messing with party primaries is not something at this point that is a viable thing, and I don't know whether that would be a good or a bad thing. In Benton County, what we chose to do is not go down that path, but shift ranked choice voting into the general election, where it's only going to apply to the candidates once they've been established by their parties. And we felt that that was the most viable way to get it passed, to then look at, is this a good system for Oregon? This is, as we've kind of talked about, this has been implemented in many other places, but the real question is, in Oregon, with Oregonians, is this something that works for us? And so that's how we started moving it, and it's only for county-wide offices, I guess I should say. So it would only apply to county commissioners, will not apply to city offices, state representatives. We amended the county charter to implement this. And so some of the benefits we talked about is, and I'll talk about our messaging, what our polling told us, is people like majority representation. That's something I think that is fundamental within all of us. That was something that applied to all spectrums. So one of our things was ensures majority representation. And in fact, I think our slogan was more choices, more voices, majority representation. And so the first part of that is more choices. People like more choices. You rank 1, 2, 3. More voices. In a situation like this where we're not discouraging voices for participating, we have more people engaged in the system, or at least that's the goal. And then the last part is ensuring majority representation. But there should be a caveat when we talk about majority representation, and this is something that is always brought up, is that if you have a high undervote, when you, and let's take a step back, and I'm going to dig into the weeds with you guys a little bit here, because I think this is an important thing to understand, so bear with me. In a race, the way it works is you have, let's say you have 4 candidates. Okay, everybody ranks 1 through 4, and the person, if someone has a majority, they win outright. No need to go through the process. And in most races, somebody does have a majority. In the cases where we don't have a majority, you might find that on the city council in Portland, mayor, things like that. Then what happens is the candidate with the least amount of votes is eliminated. And anyone that voted for that candidate has their second choice votes instantly tabulated for their second choice candidates, and everything is recast. Now you have 3 candidates. Now, when that vote is recast, someone might have only voted for 1 candidate. And so in the second round, this is where it gets wonky, they're going to be counted as an undervote. Okay? You might only rank 2 candidates. And so in the third round of voting, if nobody has a majority, that would be counted as an undervote. So when we say majority representation, depending on the round that you're in, and that's a really confused look, and it should be, but I'm trying my best, I apologize. When you get into that third round, you could have a significant amount of undervotes. And it really is the majority of the folks that participated in that round. So and we'll talk about some of the cons, but I just wanted to really describe, when we talk about majority representation, what does that actually mean in the context of this. As we talked about, there can be less negativity. This race, I mean, what I would have to say is, on our national context, we can talk about that negativity apparently is rewarded in some situations, right? And so in a race like this, are we really going to see less negativity? The studies show yes, there will be less negativity, but from a humanistic standpoint, when we reward negativity by electing those folks into office, it continues to encourage that type of behavior. But in theory, I wouldn't want to attack my other opponent if I want to earn their support. Right, that's an important concept. The thing that I really like about this is from a candidate perspective. From a candidate perspective, I'm no longer just trying to earn my traditional base. those amount of votes. What I need to do is the game has been altered from a political standpoint. I need to earn not only first choice votes, I need to earn second choice votes. So ordinarily, maybe I only go to the Democrats' meetings, and this time I might say, you know what, I need to start going to these Green Party meetings, because I don't need them to split 60-40, I need them to split 80-20. And so it encourages me as a candidate to reach out to other groups that I otherwise might not have reached out to. And so that's something that I really found compelling about it. The other thing is from a governing standpoint, and Chris talked about this a little bit as well. As an elected official, I want to know, where did my votes come from? So if I got 30% from Democrats, and 30% were from, progressives, and 10% were from libertarians on that first initial ballot where it was going down. That gives me a really good cross-section of how my community is feeling and where their values align. And I think that that's helpful for folks in a governing perspective. That's something that I don't think is really compelling in a campaign mailer when you're trying to pass ranked choice voting. But from an elected official standpoint, that means a lot to me. That's valuable information that I can have so that I can be a better representative. And then we talked about more voices encouraged in the process, which I think, and I don't think there's a lot of good data, and this is one of the things that I really want to see in Benton County, is that I think having more voices will lead to better turnout, more engagement. And it kind of shows in kind of the underlying data is people want more voices. And in Benton County, if you look at the undervote of the county commissioner races, any time that we have had multiple parties running for office, we've had a smaller percentage of undervote. And so if you can get those folks engaged in clicking their first preference to then click their second preference and third preference, we've now engaged more voters where otherwise they may not have chosen to vote in that race. And just like I hearken back to the exit polls with Ralph Nader, 40% of those folks would not have cast a ballot had Ralph Nader not been running. Well, what if we could have reached those folks and they could have cast that second choice and that third choice? Then we start reaching out to those folks. And that's something that I think, and that's one of the things that I really want to do in Benton County, is study this in kind of a double-blind study where the studies you were looking at were really kind of comparing similar jurisdictions. What I'd like to do in a perfect world is where we have two county commissioner races running side by side over multiple general elections, is have one with 2 parties versus one with 4 parties and be able to compare the two in a same jurisdiction with the same voters and see how they react. And then we'll get some more data as we start looking at, is this good for us in Oregon? Some of the cons, and very transparent, it's not a perfect system. I said no system is a perfect system. Mathematically, there are ways where someone can be elected to office where a majority of the people would prefer to have one of the other candidates elected. Very similar to what happens, currently under the plurality system. It just happens much, much less. It's an improvement, but it's not a perfect system. And so you have to acknowledge that. There are costs to the system in terms of voting machines. Also in terms recounts could be a little bit more costly in terms of how do you go about that. It's just going to be more time intensive. Also, how do you administer a system statewide? If you were to move to a statewide system, well, right now in Benton County, we can sit there and say, okay, this is, for a governor's race, this is who the winner is. We tabulate everything on. Instead, we have to move all the data to one location and then start tabulating things from there on how that works, just the way ranked choice voting works. So you can have slower returns. That's something that a lot of people, I think, in American society, we like things now, and we want it fast. Although I think for a better government, I'm willing to wait a day. So that's just me. Let's see here. Some of the other things that we have, why we chose ranked choice voting over some of the others. So you have approval voting. Approval voting has its positives. You have there's the range voting, the board account, which is kind of a modification of ranked choice voting. And you can look at these different options and say, well, why might I want to do some of these? The real big negatives with some of these other ones are manipulation. And that is the main reason that I tend to prefer ranked choice voting, because in any situation when we're electing our government officials, I don't want to have any influences or any incentives for folks to vote dishonestly. That's a real big problem. And so with approval voting, you can vote for each candidate that you think is acceptable. However, anytime you vote against for another candidate, a second vote, it really is a vote against your first candidate in a lot of ways. And so you can manipulate the results if you had where you only, what we call bullet voting, where you only vote for one candidate. And that way you're not adding up to kind of game the system. And all of the other types of elements, really, there is this gaming of the system. From a mathematical and from a value standpoint, some of these systems may be better, but from the realities of a political context where we have consultants and we have money and people strategizing on how to get their candidates elected, it is an absolute reality that people will, or consultants will then start sending mailers, only vote one, only do this. And there's actually real world examples of this that went on. I think one of the best examples historically in the United States would be going back to, I think it was John Adams and Thomas Pinckney, when we used to actually do somewhat of a modified approval voting where we did for our president and vice president, where you'd vote for two candidates. The one with the most became the president, the one with the second most became the vice president. And the way that was working is we would actually modify, there was actually a campaign at that point, so that John, I think it was Thomas Pinckney, would get less votes than John Adams. This is getting really wonky. I'm losing you guys. I can tell right there. I can tell. And what happened is actually Thomas Jefferson, then actually scooted in. And so, I mean, historically, we've always gamed the system as people trying, because we're passionate. We care about things. We want to make sure our candidates that represent our values get into office. And so any system can't have any of that in there, in my humble opinion. Others would disagree, and there are many that disagree. And then the other thing is the majority rule. The big difference between like approval voting, some of these other, the range voting, is we entirely scrap this concept of majority. And that is difficult, I think, structurally, as Americans who've, we've basically, lived for centuries with this system to do. I think it's possible, but it's difficult to do. So the future, and we can talk about how did this pass. It wasn't easy. It took a lot of signatures, a lot of labor, mailers, and a lot of volunteer effort, but that's a separate conversation. But what does the future hold for ranked choice voting in Oregon? In Benton County, what I can tell you is we are going to run this through several general election cycles, study it, see if this is right for Oregon, and a real big thing that we have to do is make sure that it's implemented correctly. And it takes a lot of education to implement this correctly. Because if you have somebody if there's a high undervote, right? And so someone only ranks one candidate and doesn't rank the rest. That's going to hurt the outcome and affect the outcome of this election. So you need to have an educated electorate, and we're going to be spending, doing much like the campaign that it took to pass this, we'll be doing a very active campaign to make sure that it's implemented properly, not only from a county-wide administrative level, but also from a local level in terms of going door to door, making sure people know how to use the ballot and implementing this as best we can to ensure the best results.
Thank you. These are not working. Oh, this one is. Good. So we now have 2 microphones. That's a step in the right direction. And I would like, first of all, to thank all of our speakers. It was very helpful, and that was an extremely useful presentation of what we just accomplished down in Benton County. And this now concludes the second part of the forum on election methods. Is there a better way to vote? In the last part, the third and last part, we will be able to have our speakers talk to each other and delve more deeply into some of the issues that have been raised. So stay with us for the third section, and we will be back in just a few seconds.